Thank you very much. It's exciting to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. And it's great to see such interest in conservation finance. You do know there's a drone session on nearby, right? No, but it's really exciting. This is going to be some of the PhD research I've completed recently. And a big shout out to my supervisor, James Fitzsimons, and Sarah Beckersey and Aslan Gordon, who are based at RMIT University. If you do want to make fun of my accent, feel free to do that in person, or you can do it via Twitter if you're a tweeter. It'd be interesting to see that, actually. Yeah. So I probably don't need to argue too strongly here how important private land is for our conservation efforts. In Australia, privately protected areas, as one form of private land conservation, cover almost 9 million hectares from a study James did a few years ago now. And another study that came out this year in parks that James was also a part of is recognising that Australia has the largest PPA contribution by area across the world. So quite exciting there. And most of that is made up of private reserves and conservation covenants. And you've already seen this figure today, but really just pointing out that the growth in the number of covenants and the area covered by them is really taken off in the last 10 or so years. So conservation covenants in Australia, they're an on-title binding and in perpetuity agreement between a landholder and a covenanting organisation. They're thought to be the most permanent and secure mechanism out there for private land. They usually require multiple parties to sign on to the agreement, but also to take it off, making them quite secure. And they're backed by acts of parliament through state legislation. But, you know, questions still remain about how permanent these things are. Especially due to issues with mining rights and changing landowners and conservation policy changes, etc. So a few years ago now, but it's come out in conservation letters recently, we did a bit of a survey of the conservation organisations out there who put covenants on title, just to see how many of these things are actually being released, i.e. removed from title. Very few, 0.12%, that's not very many at all. We did find from those surveys that the organisations are a little bit worried about things like third-party damage. What happens if someone comes in and damages that land who is not part of that agreement? Elderly landowners who are losing capacity to manage that land through time, as well as people who come in and buy that property subsequently. And then the long-standing issue of mining rights, which it sounds like there's an issue here as well. But that notwithstanding, more covenants would be great. There's still plenty of private land out there that needs protecting with this mechanism. And one way we can do that, a pathway to getting covenants, is through a revolving fund. And essentially what they do, a land trust or an organisation will go out and identify a piece of private land with really high conservation value. They'll buy it, they'll sell it to someone who's going to look after it, and in the process add one of these conservation covenants or easements or servitudes, as I understand they are here. They then use the sale proceeds from selling the property to go out and do that again, hence the revolving nature of the fund. Through my PhD research, I found 21 major funds acting like this throughout the world, already protected over 680,000 hectares, so it's quite impressive. There are 5 major fund programs in Australia. There's a few little ones, but the 5 major ones already created 150 privately protected areas, 145,000 hectares protected. And interestingly, they've done this with $30 million, which is quite impressive. But what's particularly cool about revolving funds, and maybe I'm alone in finding them cool, but they're potentially financially self-sustaining, and that's quite unique for a private land conservation mechanism, in fact, a conservation mechanism in general. Gets me excited. So I held some interviews with managers of revolving fund programs in Australia, just to try to get a sense of how they select properties when they're going out there to choose them. And what they consistently told us was, properties vary in their suitability. You can't do it with everything. And they tend to target rural lifestyle properties, small land holdings that people want to live on with remnant conservation values. When they're deciding what to buy, resale is a really key factor here. And they find that that's influenced by a range of values. So what sort of conservation values it has, what sort of financial value, how attractive it would be socially, etc. But in their decisions, not surprisingly, it's a little bit complex to make the trade-offs that are necessary when you're buying this. So you can imagine there's a patch of land that's really important for conservation, but to be able to resell it, you want to make sure that it's something that people are going to buy. So, you know, a really nice piece of grassland's not going to resell quite quickly, so maybe that's not a good trade-off to make. And to sell the property, you might also have to set off a piece of land within the property that someone can build a house. There's a bit of a trade-off there for conservation. But for the managers, you can see there's lots of uncertainty here, lots of competing objectives when they're finding a property, so really challenging for managers to work through. And just to help kind of illustrate what the decision looks like, you know, this amazing purple piece of land comes up that the conservation organisation thinks about buying. There's essentially two questions that the manager is going to ask. The first, in the green diamond there, is, you know, is the property actually suitable for what we're trying to do here? And secondly, in the orange diamond, just how much do we pay for this property? Do we really spend a lot, or just kind of get it for whatever we can? And that's kind of relative to the market value of that property. And so the managers look at a few things when they're assessing these properties. So, you know, is there any threatened species or communities on the property? Does it contribute to the reserve system? Are there some landscape scale attributes that would help out here for a buffer or a conservation corridor, that sort of thing? Financially, you know, how much is it going to cost to do this? How long is it going to take to sell? What sort of price we're going to get back when we do on-sell it? And then how attractive is this property for people? So are there any amenity values? Is it a nice place to live? Are there services to help someone live here? What are the neighbours like? Are they going to be worried with a greenie coming along and putting a conservation covenant on their famous patch of land down the road? So you can see for managers there's a lot to assess here, and probably really unrealistic that you could assess all of these in the time that it takes for that property to come off the market and not be available anymore. So it'd be really good to identify which of these are most important. But never fear, we have Bayesian belief networks to help us out here. For the non-nerds in the room, don't worry. It's a way of probabilistic reasoning under uncertainty. So as an example, do I take an umbrella to work today? This is a big problem in Melbourne. It's talked about over the water cooler many times. But you can set up a simple BBN to help you with this if you wish. So there's two factors that I believe would influence my decision. One being, is there clouds in the sky? And the second being what I heard on the weather report that morning. And I could combine that evidence, whether it's through quantitative data or just my own expert knowledge about weather. I could combine that information and go, okay, I'm going to take an umbrella. The grey clouds outside look really bad, so I'm just going to take my umbrella today. But we can do much cooler stuff with that, and that's what we tried to do here. We developed a draft BBN based on the interview data that I just kind of walked through, and refined the BBN model with Revolving Fund experts in a decision workshop context. After that, there was a lot of heads exploding in that workshop. We did a sensitivity analysis on that model to identify which bits in that model are the most important for assessing revolving fund properties, and then tested that out through a scenario analysis. So plugging in different types of properties into the model and sort of seeing what the model was telling us. And here's what the model looks like, just a brief walkthrough. So conservation value is a really important thing here. So landscape value, the experts told us. Ecological site value, so are there threatened species or anything like that? And how under threat is the property? Is it likely to be developed in the near future and lose its conservation values? Financial value, made up of the costs of buying and managing whilst you're holding the property before you on-sell it. How long it's going to take you to sell it, what price you're going to get back, and then what's the property market doing in general? Is it going down? Is it going up? Is it staying stable? And then on the social side, site amenity is a really nice place to live. Can I plug in my internet? And wider amenity. What's the schools like down the road? Are there a nice place to get a coffee and a newspaper in the morning? All of these things contributing to how we resell the property. And then they threw a curveball in, thank you very much. But what sort of alternatives are out there for protecting this property? If you can do it through another means, maybe that's a bit easier than trying to on-sell it. So that's the suitability question. And the second is, how much do we pay for this property? We've thought it might be suitable, and that's influencing how much we pay for it. But what's the money in the bank looking like? Do we have enough money to go out there and buy it? And that's going to influence how much we can pay. All right, the exciting bit, the results. So what you're looking at here is a figure indicating the sensitivity analysis for the suitability node in the model. On the y-axis, you've got all the different nodes in the model, and on the x-axis, just an indicator of importance, I guess, or influence. And the ones that I've circled there are the ones that are most influential on whether a property is suitable or not. So development threat, how likely it is to be developed and ecological values lost, what it's going to be to, how expensive it's going to be to acquire and manage whilst you own it, and what other options are out there for protecting the property. Looking at the resale components, which is obviously a very important part of revolving funds, site amenity value, far and away the most important factor if a manager's looking at a property and worried about if they can sell it on or not. And now we're looking at the how much to pay node. Again, the three most important there being development threat and options for protection, but far and away account balance, how much money you've actually got in your bank account. So kind of intuitive there. And this is the scenario analysis results. I don't have time to go through all of it, and it's probably a little bit boring in this context, but I've circled the exciting bits. And two bits to draw from this, one being properties with high conservation value and resale potential are more suitable, kind of intuitive. And secondly, managers are telling us that it's they're more likely to pay at or below market value. Only very few instances will they pay above what the property is worth according to a registered valuer. All right, let's distill this down into something useful. The current thinking, they're looking for managers are looking for properties with low financial impact. So, and this is after resale, not just while they buy it and own it, but after they on-sell it. They're looking for properties that are under threat, that are going to make a good contribution to conservation, and are unlikely to be protected through other means. And they're also looking for a high likelihood of resale. So there's a lot in there, but I think we can distill that down into, we want to buy properties, if I was a manager, we want to buy properties of low investment risk. But I would argue that there's a few potential opportunities here we can draw from. There might be properties out there where it's actually worth taking a financial hit on. There might be really important properties that are really hard to conserve through other means. For example, agricultural properties that are really expensive to acquire, or landowners just don't want to be part of a conservation mechanism. So you can intervene there and make some really good conservation gains. There might be others that are really hard to on-sell. They might be in really remote areas. They might have really unattractive vegetation that people don't want to live on. But that's not to say there aren't buyers out there who would be interested in that, like a local bird group or someone who gets really excited about wetlands. Or taking it a step further, you could say, well, it may not be of high conservation value now, but what if we did put a bit of money into restoring this and revegetating it? And we could extend the habitat of this super important threatened species. There might be an opportunity there to use the potential for resale to make a really cost-effective conservation gain there. So all in all, taking a bit more of a riskier approach to your purchasing. So trying to turn this into something useful for either managers of revolving funds or those who are thinking of setting them up. There's a few points that are worth considering. Identifying your conservation priorities, what are you actually worried about conserving? Identifying what you consider to be important in a suitable property for resale. So conservation values might be part of that, but your costs, what sort of social attractiveness does it have, other site amenity values, and what sort of resale criteria is acceptable for your organisation. You can then use that information and overlay it with what's actually going on in the property market to identify hotspots out there where you think this kind of approach might work. You can use landowner surveys or you can use property market data. And then establish some guidelines for managers about how much to pay and how long it should take to resell these properties. So should a manager always purchase below market value, or is it sometimes okay to overextend and pay a little bit more? Or take the risk of taking a long time to on-sell those properties. and to help reduce costs, which we all want to do. There might be opportunities to engage a partner organisation to help, they might be a restoration expert, or they might have networks into birding communities or whatever that will help on-sell the property in a reasonable time. Like everything, some ongoing challenges for revolving funds. Suitability for the manager is a property-by-property decision. It's very hard to do it in a strategic way. And in this particular study, we've explored what managers are currently thinking. It may not be true in a proper sense, but it's what they're actually enacting. And it may differ in other contexts, for example, here in South Africa. But the BBN shows potential as a decision tool to help managers figure that out. It'd be really interesting to explore the experience in Australia about what's been purchased in the past and see if the model actually fits with what's been a success and what hasn't been a success. But a broader question here is what happens over time. If you imagine you keep choosing the same sort of properties all the time, there's going to be consequences. There might be a different approach that might be more effective. And that was something else I explored in my PhD, which I don't have time to go into now. Suffice to say that, yeah, there is an impact depending on which sort of strategy, or potential impact, depending on what sort of strategy you choose. If you keep choosing properties with only conservation and low resale opportunities, you could be losing a lot of conservation gain by doing that. So in conclusion, suitability decisions are quite complex and multidimensional. We took an interdisciplinary approach and applied a BBN to help identify what the assessment priorities might look like. And from the experience of managers, it suggests that revolving funds might be useful for high priority properties with low resale and financial risk. But I would argue that there's potential to extend their contribution to something a little bit trickier that might be hard to conserve through other means. But you're probably all thinking this, revolving funds can't conserve everything, and I think we should remember that, but they are still a potentially useful part of the private land conservation toolbox. Just a quick shout out, yep, there it is, to the revolving fund programs who participated in the study and provided lots of really useful data. To the colleagues at the RMIT Interdisciplinary Conservation Science Research Group, that is a mouthful. There's a few papers that have come out and are coming out, and the one I've just talked about today is in review, so stay tuned if you're interested. Thank you very much.